Perfect. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Rachel Helvering and I work in community engagement at the Tennessee State Museum. And before we get started, I just want to go over a couple housekeeping things. The biggest one is please make sure you're muted. You can do that at the bottom of the screen. There's a little microphone and you just want to make sure there's a red line through it so that we know that you're muted and nothing will interfere too much. We're excited today to have our director with us and a speaker with us. If you have any questions as this program goes on and you want to ask them, please do. You can do that in our chat bar. There's a chat button on mine. It's in the bottom right hand of the screen, but click on that and choose all panelists. We'll all be able to see your questions and we'll be able to answer them at the end. And then again, if you have any tech questions, if you need help with your volume or anything like that, send us a message to all panelists and we can assist you. So we are thrilled to have our director, Ashley Howell, with us. She chose our book for book club today. So without further ado, Ashley, take it over.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm Ashley Howell, the Executive Director of the Tennessee State Museum. And this month, the museum has kicked off Tennessee at 225 Highlights from the Collection, which is a self-guided tour within the museum galleries and an online exhibition showcasing 100 objects from the museum's collection. These objects tell an expansive story about Tennessee from its first peoples to present day. One of those featured objects is a large-scale portrait of Andrew Jackson, painted by Ralph E.W. Earl. The painting is in the Tennessee Historical Society collection at the Tennessee State Museum, and it is also a painting that was featured in Earls Museum in 1818. We will find out more about that painting and about the artist, Ralph E.W. Earl, from our distinguished speaker, Dr. Rachel Stevens. Dr. Stevens is an associate professor of art history at the University of Alabama. She holds a bachelor's in art history from Sewanee, a master's from Vanderbilt, and a Ph.D. from the University of Iowa. Her research interests include Southern art of the Jacksonian and antebellum areas, political portraits and prints, and race and representation in 19th century American art. She recently served as a visiting senior fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery in Washington. She is currently finishing a new book, so we're pleased to have her, because I know she's busy in finishing this project. This book is Hidden in Plain Sight, Slavery and Concealment in Antebellum American Art. And tonight, she's going to discuss her first book, my book club pick, Selling Andrew Jackson, Ralph E.W. Earl, and the Politics of Portraiture, published in 2018 by the University of South Carolina Press. So Dr. Stevens, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Shall I take it away?
Take it away. I was going to say, I know you're going to show us some great slides and walk us through your research.
Okay. Hi, and thank you all for coming so much, for being here, especially in this age of Zoom fatigue or WebEx fatigue, if you will. And special thanks to you, Ashley, for not only inviting me, for selecting the book for book club, but I'm also so excited that the painting is in the 100 objects for Tennessee's birthday at 225. So I think it's a great choice, and I'll tell you a little bit more about about the painting a little bit later. But I also thank you for championing Earl and for recognizing what I believe is his significance in the trajectory of Tennessee and especially Nashville history. Thanks also to Rachel Helvering and the whole museum team for organizing the event tonight. So I'm going to spend hopefully about 30 minutes or so first laying out my own avenues for studying Earl. Some of you have read the book, some of you haven't. So I'll lay out the book and Earl and Jackson and how I went about researching them. not only will I discuss the book and maybe kind of lay out some of the key ideas that I thought were important in publishing it, but also the centrality of Nashville to it and to Earl's work and to Jackson, of course. And then I'll hit on some avenues of future consideration. But I'm going to go really quick because I want to show a lot of things. So feel free to pop questions as they arise into the chat, and we'd love to address those at the end of the program too. Let me share my screen. Okay, can we see that? Great. Okay, so I came to study Earl through being initially inspired by the 2003 exhibition at the Frisch Center, their inaugural exhibition, Art of Tennessee. Many of you are probably very familiar with that show, which featured several of Earl's paintings. And in the accompanying catalog, of course, it had Earl's equestrian portrait, Andrew Jackson astride Sam Patch is what it's called, from 1833 on the cover. And I was working on my MA, and there's the painting for you. I was working on my MA in art history at Vandy at the time. And then when it came time a few years later to select a dissertation topic, I thought back to Earl and these paintings. And I found in beginning to research him a little bit that nothing had been written about him. And there was actually a lot of archival records about him, relatively nothing had been written, I should say. And the archival collection is really rare for artists in the South who were usually itinerant and Earl certainly was to a certain extent, and who often just didn't save their papers. Well, luckily many of his were saved. A lot of that has to do with his association with Jackson. There was so much, curiosity and fame there. And so it was also a topic that really interested me. So my research involved at a base level, kind of piecing together Earl's life and his biography. There were a lot of unknown or misstated facts about it. For example, I'm fairly certain that he was born in 1788. We don't know this for sure, but it was often thought that he was born in 1735. And there are a few pieces of evidence of this, but his passport, which I found at Library of Congress, lists his age as 27 at the time he got this on his return journey from France, where he had been studying, back to the US. So lists his age as 27. It's dated to 1815. So that's one of those pieces that says, oh, 1788 is probably more likely for a birth date. I studied as many of his paintings as I could, and he was remarkably prolific. Earl painted very quickly. He painted dozens and dozens of portraits from the time he started painting, which was at age 12 in 1800, to his death in 1838. He seemed to have been constantly painting and painting very, very quickly, especially during the Jackson years. And just for a sense of that, he came to Nashville in 1817, which is when he met Jackson, and he painted him for the rest of his life till his untimely death in 1838. So many of his paintings, fortunately, are in Nashville collections. So the Hermitage has a major collection of Earl paintings, of course. Tennessee State Museum has many, many portraits like this one of Dr. Horace Holly. And this one is a really simple, one of his most basic standard portraits. And I'll talk about his museum in a little bit, but I think this is an example of the type of painting he was doing specifically to display in his museum, kind of like offering a uniformity of heads around a room is the sense I get of the goal here, and the focus being on the individual person he was representing. In this case, Horace Holly was the president of Transylvania University, Lexington, Kentucky. And of course, there are lots of connections between Trancy and Jackson. Anyway, they're also scattered in museums across the country, and many of them are still in private hands. The Farmer Jackson, which I'll show in a little bit, is, so far as I know, still in a private collection, which is still in the original family for whom it was painted, which is Preston Blair's family. So many paintings still are in their original family collections, which is nice as well. So tracking down paintings from there, I read everything I could about Earl. I read in depth about Jackson, and I kind of started to try to look at their activities in tandem. Just to give you a sense of where all of those rich archives are of Earl stuff. Of course, there's a range, or there's a whole collection of things at the Hermitage, including this portrait of Rachel Jackson, and lots of other portraits, but also lots of artifacts of Earls because he lived at the Hermitage for so long. Tennessee State Library and Archives has a whole range of archival resources, really an incredible amount of information, a lot about his museum, some of his papers and letters and correspondence. There's papers for the families he painted for, which sometimes give interesting information. There's lots of Jackson archives. The Library of Congress Jackson papers are there on microfilm, and all of the Tennessee newspapers are there as well, which Earl advertised in a lot. I found a lot of information about his museum as well in those early Tennessee newspapers. The images you're looking at here are little diagrams of, I think it's Bledsoe Lick in around Gallatin, which had some Native American mounds that Earl not only attempted to excavate, but was very interested in recording. And he helped document a lot of Native American mounds throughout Middle Tennessee. He was working closely with Judge Haywood. So these are just little sketches of what he was seeing at these mounds from 1821. And he sketched these in a letter that he wrote to Haywood to detail, 7 or 8 pages of what he was seeing at these. So there's, and we'll come back to those as well. Oops. There are 2 major collections of Earl archives, correspondence, lists that he made. He doesn't really have a diary, but in 1817, there's a recording of every painting that he did. And those things are at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. They have 3 folders of Earl papers. And then the big collection is at Library of Congress. Held within the John Spencer Bassett papers are 17 folders chocked full of lots of different ephemera from throughout Earl's life, lots of letters to him, from him. It's really an incredible resource. And what I'm showing here is maybe my favorite find of all, which is Earl's letter to his mother. He wasn't close with his family. The Jackson and his family were really Earl's adopted family in his adulthood. But he did correspond with them. They lived in New York and Massachusetts. And this is a letter from 1821. It's a long letter, like 4 pages or so. And it gives Earl's activities of the previous 5 or 6 years, which is critical because it told in Earl's own words what he had been up to throughout the teens and 20s or until 1821. And it just gave so much information that it really helped piece together his biography. All right, so my first project was my dissertation, which was about Earl. I completed that in 2010 for the PhD at the University of Iowa. It's called America's Portraitist. It's easily Googleable and downloadable in PDF if you really want to dive into a dissertation. Not many people do, but the goal of my project there was to do exactly what I've been talking about, which is to piece together the Earl story, his career-long trajectory, his significance, including Jackson, but also beyond Jackson within early American artistic and cultural circles, and also in Tennessee itself. So he painted virtually all of the white financially elite members of Nashville society, like the Foster family here. This painting is his most elaborate group portrait, and you could argue most charming, I think, but this one's at Cheekwood. And these sort of help, I argue, all of these portraits set a really important artistic precedent in Middle Tennessee for the artwork that came after. His influence really can't be overstated, I think, for the rest of the 19th century. in terms of Middle Tennessee portraiture at the least. I also covered his museum in depth in my dissertation, and his museum is a remarkable enterprise. It was located in downtown Nashville. He opened it in 1818 as a museum to display his paintings, his portraits, but also as a museum of what he called natural and artificial curiosities. So this had everything from Roman armor to Native American artifacts to anything that may be of interest, but especially for Earl, maybe educational. He was very interested in this sort of benevolent educational value of an enlightened society. And so he opened that museum, and he ran it from 1818 until 1825, which is when he sold the collection and turned over leadership of it so he could focus on, I believe, helping Jackson get elected the president, which happened in 1828. He had just lost the election in 24. So I think that's where his focus really shifted from there. As Ashley mentioned, the kind of crown jewel of the museum was this portrait of Andrew Jackson, painted in 1818, a large portrait of Jackson on the battlefield in the Battle of New Orleans. Earl never did a historical scene of the battle as he had intended. This is the closest he ever got to that, just those kind of shadowy battlefield activities in the background, and he's standing before his tent. But by 1818, Andrew Jackson was a nationally renowned figure for his military exploits, particularly heroicized in the victory of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. So this was a celebratory piece for people, and no one in Nashville had ever seen a grand historical portrait like this before, and they were very, very impressed with it. And of course, it stayed with Earl's core collection of objects and paintings from the museum, and it remains in downtown Nashville today in the Tennessee State Museum, which has pieces of Earl's original collection. So I think, and Ashley can talk about this later, I think the State Museum can trace its roots all the way back to 1818, which is pretty incredible, especially in somewhere like Nashville in 1818, which was considered frontier and Western country, as they would say. So I'll briefly outline now where the research took me for this book, Selling Andrew Jackson. I'll start here. I trace it chronologically, and I trace Earl's life and commitment and developing commitment to Jackson chronologically throughout the book. And so I start with his early years. I felt it was important to talk about, at least to give information about Earl's early training, but also about his life because it hadn't been recorded before. But this is a portrait by his father, Ralph Earl. And his father was a fairly, actually very well-known colonial portraitist in New England. And here is one of his best known works. It's Elijah Boardman that's located in the Met. It's a representative example of his work. But the senior Earl was Ralph E.W. Earl's first teacher. So Earl's training came with his dad. You can see a lot of the influence of his father's style in his own portraits. And he also learned how to be an itinerant artist from his dad, because his father traveled around, at least when Earl was a child and coming up. Ralph Earl Sr. was traveling around New England, painting portraits itinerantly, and baby Earl was in tow, coming up under his father and learning the tricks of the trade. There are actually no portraits of Ralph E.W. Earl that I know. He painted one while he was in England. I don't know where that one is, but I think he appears in this little charming scene from his father's landscape view of Old Bennington from 1798. So say he's about 10 years old here. I think he's traveling, probably learning with his father. And in this detail, that might be little Earl posing for his dad, which is kind of charming. And he had an older sister, Mary Ann, who I think is here. Anyway, his father passed away from alcoholism in 1801, leaving a 13-year-old Earl on his own to try to help support his mother and his sister. They moved to Troy, New York, and settle. And Earl begins his career at that point, kind of incredibly. So here you see an 1806 advertisement. There are lots of advertisements in the Troy Gazette from 1804 to 1810 of Earl advertising his willingness to paint portraits of local people. And he gained some prestige doing this. And in fact, he saved enough money to travel abroad eventually, which he did in 1810. Before I get too far ahead of myself, though, here is his first portrait, which is location unknown, but his father was painting little Edward Gere, 2-year-old Edward Gere's parents, and he gave the commission to for the son to his then 12-year-old son who was learning. So that's a charming example of his early work, and I love how big he signed it. He was so proud of that. Here's two representative examples of Earl's work that he did during those years. He had his studio in Troy. He also traveled itinerantly as his father had and painted the upper middle classes in New England. And many of the stylistic elements that he used while he was there, be it like a Baroque swept back curtain, finely detailed costume and individuality, and almost a naive folk feel to the crisp clarity of these paintings, we see translated into a lot of his Tennessee works. But he changes some things about the Tennessee works as well, which we can get into. Earl traveled to Europe to study, like I said, in 1810. He was in London for a year studying with the creme de la creme of artists there, namely John Trumbull and Benjamin West. And from there, he went to his mother's hometown, which was Norwich, England, for 4 years, and joined an artistic club and exhibited and did mostly portraits, but was very prolific there. And then he spent a final year, 1814 to 15, in France, where he painted this portrait of Napoleon. Now, later he would claim that he got a live sitting from Napoleon for this portrait. I cannot confirm that, and it does look very French in style. So it could have been a copy of another portrait. I haven't identified the original source. But this is important because this sort of helped Earl solidify his standing as a European gentleman when he arrived in Tennessee. And the fact that he had trained abroad, the fact that he had painted Napoleon and had these international experiences really helped elevate him in the minds of Middle Tennesseans. And I have to think that included Jackson. So he had this painting shipped from France to Nashville when he opened his museum so he could exhibit it in the museum. And of course, it's still there in Middle Tennessee in Nashville at the Tennessee State Museum and currently on view, which is very, very exciting, I think. So Earl gained immediate success when he arrived in Nashville. He arrived there over 200 years ago. January 1st, 1817 is when he came. And his list of commissioned portraits from that year, and it's the only year we have a list of what he painted, but in 1817, he was commissioned to do 86 portraits of Nashvillians. These included 9 of Jackson. So several people around town would order not only their own portrait, perhaps that of their spouse, but also one of Jackson. And so this sort of kicked off his career right away in Nashville. And he was able within 3 or 4 months to gain a sitting with Jackson. And the rest was history from there, you might say. But one of these, for example, these early portraits, here's James Winchester. Earl and Winchester had a long association after this. He was one of his first sitters. He also painted his wife and his daughter. And those portraits were kind of recently rediscovered, and those have been cleaned and they're on display at Craig Font today. If I'm marching us through the trajectory of the book, we're in chapter 2 now, which talks about, it's called The City. in Setting the Stage, Earl in Nashville. And it discusses Earl's time in Nashville and also how he operated in Nashville, not only as a portraitist, but within Jackson's inner circle, and really, I believe, helping to elevate the culture of Nashville to a place that Jackson, a future president, would be proud and happy to call home. And so he's helping, I think, increase the cultural intrigue and interest in Nashville with just his presence and with the presence of an internationally trained artist there, and then ultimately operating within Jackson's circle. I think it's an important part of the story. Oh, I wanted to show you the scale. It is the terrible picture of me. Here you get, just so if you haven't seen the painting, you can get a sense. This is a life-size portrait of Jackson, if not bigger. And so this was super impressive to Nashvilleians when they saw it in Earl's Museum. Here's an example of the other types of paintings of Nashvilleians that Earl did in the up to about 1825, after which he turns his attention more squarely to painting Jackson. But this is Anne Phillips Rogers Grundy. She was the wife of Felix Grundy. She's considered to be the founder of Sunday School. It's an excellent example of those early Tennessee portraits, which are somewhat plain. They're crisp and clear. A realistic likeness of the figure is usually really important to Middle Tennesseans, but they're simple. The attire is fashionable. They're against a plain background, sometimes with a chair. And Earl painted dozens of these. This one's in Downtown Presbyterian Church in collection in Nashville, but there's scores of examples that I could show you. So in the third chapter of the book, I talk about those portraits of Jackson that Earl did before he was elected to the presidency. So there are very, very few portraits of Jackson that date to before Earl. So Earl painted him in 1817. And that was another sort of anomaly, that here was this artist that could and would paint quasi-realistic, and everyone called his paintings realistic at the time, portraits of Jackson, compared to a couple of others that had been done before that just are much less convincing, like this portrait by a French artist where Jackson looks almost like a French soldier, or this one, just a much less convincing likeness by Nathan Wheeler, and this is at the State Museum as well. So Earl painted, like I said, at least 9 portraits of Jackson in 1817, and we have identified 3 of those that he did that year. And you can see, looking at them together, that he was able to produce work so quickly and be so prolific because he was producing, he would call these original portraits, but they're very, very similar. They're virtually copies of each other with just minor details changed. So the National Portrait Gallery version has shadowy figures in the background. In the Hermitage version, they're on horseback. The Alabama Department of Archives and Humanities is just against a plain background. There's some details like the hair. There's a braid on the epaulette in Alabama's portrait that's out of place. But for the most part, they're very, very similar. And he could produce these relatively quickly to meet demand. Because he could meet demand, he was very financially successful. So he was your rare 19th century early American artist that was financially comfortable. Portraits were in demand. He could meet the demand. He catered to what people wanted, and ultimately used his ideas to help elevate Andrew Jackson, I think, in the national mind. That Alabama portrait is probably the first one that Earl used to commission a print after. So he did this multiple times throughout his career, exhibiting a portrait. And in fact, this one was in a private collection. It was painted for a Nashvilleian whose name is Rutledge. How many people would have seen it in the Rutledge home? But if you can commission a print after it, which you can sell for $1, between $1 and $5, not a small amount of money back then, but it could reach a much bigger audience. So Earl recognized right away that if he wanted to promote Jackson's image, get more people's eyes on his optimistic view of who Jackson was, then that would help Jackson politically. So here he commissioned, it's an 1817 portrait, but he really liked it. And so he went back in 1823, I think, and borrowed the portrait and commissioned a Nashville printmaker, a young man named Charles Cutler Torrey, to make this print because he wanted to sell it in time for the election of 1824. Torrey was a slow and laborious worker, and printmaking in Nashville was in its nascent stages. So the print was not finished in time for the election. So coincidentally or not, Earl did not win that election. John Quincy Adams did, but he continued. He was bolstered enough in this effort to continue producing prints, particularly in time for the next two elections. So I focus on this print in chapter 4. He's changed the way he viewed or showed Jackson in this case. So he had always depicted Jackson in military attire up to the portrait after which this print is made. I don't know where the original portrait of this one is. But he's showing him now in civilian attire, and I would argue showing him to be presidential. He commissioned a nationally regarded printmaker, James B Longacre, to produce this. He sold hundreds and hundreds of these engravings, and it was finished in time for the election of 1828. And so I think already by 1828, he's well on his way to considering how he can use artwork and how he can image Jackson to advance Jackson's goals and political messages. And in this case, it's the election, and Jackson did win that election. He's also producing these prints, I think, as a quasi-respectable vision of Jackson in response to all of the negative cartoons and caricatures that were being circulated about Jackson. The election of 1828 was one of the hardest fought and nastiest presidential elections up to that time. It's sometimes considered the first modern election, but everything about Jackson was criticized, including some account of the bloody deeds of General Jackson, some of what we would consider horrific things that occurred on his watch during the Creek and Seminole Wars earlier. One of the favorites is The Man, the Jackass, this picture, which is a portrait of Jackson, but when it's inverted, it's a donkey. There were dozens of examples of negative cartooning. And so I think that's another really critical piece of the story, is that Earl was pitching these respectable views of Jackson in direct response to these negative views. He was also considered to use the veto with too much leverage, to command too much authority, to be too monarchical. And so here we see him pictured as a European monarch. All the while, Earl's producing not only those prints, but portrait after portrait of Jackson, sometimes in civilian attire, sometimes in military attire. I love this one because it has both. So demand for Jackson's portraits reached just fever pitch once Jackson was elected. Earl moved to the White House in 1830. He seemingly spent his full time painting Jackson in the midst, whatever else was transpiring in the midst of the presidency. Earl was in the room, in the corner, just painting. So he had unlimited access to his sitter. This is unheard of for early presidents, who often hated sitting for their portraits because it took time away, but these two developed a bond. They were very close. Jackson was in the inner circle. Earl was in the inner circle of Jackson. He was very well tuned into all of Jackson's politics because he was always in the room. In fact, he was assisting sometimes in some of those things. And so he produced portrait after portrait of Jackson in the White House to meet that demand. which was huge. Here's a few examples. So sometimes he's in his spectacles, sometimes he's not, sometimes he's in his military attire, other times he's looking more presidential and civilian attire. There's a whole range. They all are reflective of each other. They're usually a standard size, about 30 by 36, and there's lots and lots of examples. For the re-election in 1832, he produced another portrait specifically for a print. This is Farmer Jackson. And there is the print that he commissioned in time for the election of 1832. His correspondence about this print very specifically state that we need this to come out in time for the election. At the end of Jackson's second term in office, the paintings get more and more experimental. He's freed up. He's trying to figure out Jackson's legacy now instead of waging political battle. And so he attempts the equestrian. This is a study. It's a very small portrait. And ultimately, he did not complete a large-scale portrait of this. I don't think he thought it would be maybe as appropriate to link Jackson art historically to the famous equestrian images of monarchs from England and from Europe. And so instead, his final portrait is this one. It's called The National Picture. It was paid for by the citizens of Washington, D.C. This is actually the last portrait that Earl ever completed. It's large. It's in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. And it's based on Gilbert Stuart's famous George Washington Lansdowne portrait. So here Earl is drawing from past precedent to equate Jackson with founders and with those that came before him and to elevate him. We can talk more about that too. That one's in DC, but there's a study for it at the Hermitage, like a small practice, which is this one. So Earl stayed in the White House for both terms in office, and then he returned to the Hermitage where he moved in and lived with the family. After Jackson had retired back to the Hermitage, he died shortly thereafter. They returned in 1837. He passed away in 1838 of heat stroke. He had been working on the famous guitar-shaped driveway at the Hermitage, and it was late September, and he had heat stroke and unfortunately succumbed to that. But he is buried near Jackson in the family cemetery at the Hermitage. And just in closing here, I want to stress a few new directions that I'd love to follow as I continue to think about Earl and Jackson and the bigger context for this work. So piecing together the story, figuring out what Earl's motives were, what Jackson's were, was super interesting and I think important and laid some foundational ideas. But I completed that work in about 2014. And so I've had a lot of time since then to think about other projects as well as this one, and with an evolving perspective to think about, especially in light of this kind of shifting critical frameworks of the last couple years, what else are we missing in the story? How else could these paintings be interpreted? And it didn't strike me really until kind of late in my research that in the extensive personal correspondence between Earl and Jackson and to and from others, Native Americans, and especially enslaved people, very rarely appear in the correspondence. Both of those groups were actually completely central to both men's lives. And so I want to open up avenues for further consideration with these works. So we are seeing in Earl's works tamed landscapes. Could those tamed landscapes represent Jackson's overtaking of the lands of the Hermitage and other places? Likewise, what roles did enslaved people play in so-called taming that specific property? They're certainly never present in the pictures, but they were ever present in the lives of these two men. There are tiny views of the US Capitol in some of these portraits. You may have noticed in the background of both of these. Could that represent Jackson's control as president, control over Native American policy? He had signed the Indian Removal Act as soon as he came into office, just about. And so could those be referenced there? This is a rare watercolor of so-called Negroes picking cotton on General Jackson's farm by a traveling English artist. How did those enslaved people, pictured here but rarely pictured elsewhere, operating in the careers of both Jackson and Earl, help facilitate their success? That was huge, I think. Furthermore, for Native Americans, Earl was fully aware of removal policy. He was there every day in Jackson's political life, and he supported Jackson unwaveringly. For example, Jackson's address to the Chickasaw Indians from 1830 was transcribed and partially prepared by Earl in consultation with Jackson at the Hermitage. Earl, of course, was interested in capturing Native American culture, which he probably believed was disappearing, and he was certainly complicit in that. And he even he painted a portrait which is listed as Chenevey, an Indian chief, for his museum. Don't know where that painting is. I wish we had it. So I think we have to consider the people who are not usually shown in the portraits and their roles. There are photographs of several of the enslaved and formerly enslaved at Jackson's Hermitage, of course not present in those paintings, but their livelihoods and Jackson's ability to employ Earl full-time certainly depended on the work of these people. Earl depicted the Hermitage grounds and the review of the Cumberland River behind the Hermitage as tamed, as empty, which I think is certainly relevant in this case. Same thing here with his Farmer Jackson paintings. And I didn't show you this one, but this is the Gentleman Farmer as well. Tamed, vacant landscape, elevating the Tennessee gentleman or the planter elite. This is a contemporary portrait by Titus Kaphar from 2017. It's in Crystal Bridge's Museum of American Art. And Titus Kaphar is an artist who is doing this kind of work, this sort of reconsideration. In The Cost of Removal, he has used Earl's equestrian portrait of Jackson astride Sam Patch to address Native American removal. Now, Earl's equestrian is small, probably 31 inches or so, and this is huge. This is life-sized. So he has not only blown it up, but he has covered Jackson's body. In the portrait, it has these torn strips of canvas, and there are words in Jackson's script on those strips, which are Jackson's writing about Native American removal. So I think it's imperative, here's the original portrait again. Now that we read Earl's portraits against the grain, with the knowledge and the facts solidified, can we consider what other contexts we might view them in? Gone on too long? Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you. Rachel, that was great, and I especially enjoyed seeing all of the images and seeing all of the images of Jackson together, and really seeing how Earl depicts his friend, but also someone who has, talking about his success, giving this painter's success in subject matter, but also in their close relationship, and entry into his circle. And want to talk a little bit about that and talk about the relationship and talk about, as you sort of intro your book, how these paintings help craft a reputation and identity for Jackson's political image. Of course, you have detailed why that was important for Jackson, but how did that differ from previous political candidates, and why was Earl's personal relationship so important in developing that image?
Thank you for that. There's a lot for me to try to unpack there, but if I'm talking about Earl's role in Jackson's circle and why that's important, maybe first, it's very interesting, and it is very unique. So he was considered the king's painter, as some people referred to him. Jackson's right-hand man, it was well known that Earl was not only Jackson's visualizer or his artist, but that he was right there with him, especially in the White House. Rachel Jackson had passed away suddenly right before he took office. And so there are actually very touching letters from Jackson to Earl, kind of saying how he's lonely and begging him to come to the White House. Earl had this thriving career in Nashville, so it took him like, I don't know, 10 or 12 months to get that all closed up and head to Washington. But he was definitely part of this intimate family circle. Him and Andrew Jackson Donaldson dined with the president every night. So loyalty was very, very important to Jackson, and Earl had unwavering loyalty for Jackson. So was family. And Jackson considered Earl family because Earl had married Jackson's niece, or actually Rachel Jackson's niece. So working at the Hermitage, he met Jane Caffrey, who was then living at the Hermitage with her aunt. And he married Jane Caffrey in 1818. And Jane died in 1819 in childbirth. So he never remarried, but he was sort of in the family circle. And so that may have been more important than actually his artistic ability to Jackson. But it actually was just this beautiful situation that you could argue Jackson really needed the type of visual bolstering that Earl could offer. Unlike any of the 6 presidents before him, who, like I said, many of whom sort of begrudgingly sat for portraits and didn't think they really had the time to pursue it. There was never a personal artist situation before Earl, and not for a long time after either. And I think it was just the result of this really unique situation. I don't know if I answered all the sides of your question, though. Oh, you got muted, Ashley.
Thank you. But I think that access is important to these images. And I think when you talk about that trust and a trust over a period of time, but also placing Jackson in sort of, I mean, even talking about being in the right clothes, in sort of this imagery, in a military dress, as a farmer. And I think about Earl's experience in Europe. And of course, I think a lot about the portrait of Napoleon, which is at the State Museum. That is one of, and I've mentioned this to you, and I'll mention to those watching, that's one of those paintings when I'm taking somebody through, or I will hear visitors sort of whisper to each other. They say, "Is that Napoleon?" Because they're trying to figure out why is that in the Tennessee State Museum. So I'm interested in Earl's experience in Europe, and also having access to the Louvre and having access to to these sort of grand military painting traditions. How do you see Earl's experience in Europe in influencing his creative direction?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. It is a little shocking to be walking through the State Museum and seeing a portrait of Napoleon. I don't think that's what anybody expects, but it's a really interesting opportunity to, I think, insert the significance and even the artistic precedent for Earl's European experience into the story. And the fact that Earl had it shipped to Nashville to display, I think, makes an important statement. But his training in Europe was critical to a lot of things, I believe. It's unfortunate that we know very little about what actually he did and was doing there. We know he copied paintings at the Louvre. We know he witnessed military exploits and parades and Napoleon's arrival into Paris. But even more significantly, perhaps, it was a really critical year for him, sort of laying out his future career trajectory. So that year in Paris, in January of 1815, Jackson became the hero of New Orleans and solidified the victory of the United States over the British in the War of 1812. Jackson becomes a national hero. Right at the same time, Earl is there learning about European history paintings and battle paintings in Europe. So he has the idea, which is what brought him home, to come to New Orleans to paint the battlefield. He stopped first in Nashville to paint the heroes. Many of them were Tennesseans. Of course, Jackson as well. And then he just never continued on to New Orleans to do the painting because he had such great success in Nashville. So the ideas were born there. I think the printmaking idea, and there was a rich printmaking tradition in Paris as well, probably came to him either in England or Paris at the time. So I think it sort of set his career path going. And then once he arrived in Nashville, his letters regularly tout, like people had written letters of recommendation for him, letters of introduction. That was a thing in the 19th century. They tout his European training as something that was very impressive and rare for the Western country at the time. So it was all really foundational, I think.
So I'm gonna switch a little bit because I'm gonna ask you about some additional research that you've done in comparing Earl's Museum to the Museum of Charles Willson Peale. And, I think it's interesting as, you're talking about this European experience for Earl, and what he was thinking about painting and returning to the United States. Peale's Museum, for those who have joined us, it opened just a couple of years before Earl's Museum in Philadelphia, and Charles Willson Peale would paint heroes of the American Revolution. And so it served as a portrait gallery, but also had collections of insects, minerals, curiosities. And so when I, read about the description of Peale's Museum, and of course, read about the description of Earl's Museum, how much interaction did Earl have with Peale? And was that a direct influence for Earl's Museum? Again, did they interact as individuals?
I never was able to find out if Earl went to the museum. He was very well aware of it, though. So it makes me think either he had gone at some point, or he knew about it through his father, or he had read the prospectus from Peale, which laid out what the museum was. But he was very well aware of it. And we know that because when he's writing to seek donations from people who have things that he wants in his museum, like that Roman armor that was discovered in Knoxville or whatever, he's writing to say, I would like my museum to attract the same type of attention and offer the same types of education as Peale's museum in Philadelphia. So he knew about it. I think he modeled his practice after it. So Peale, I think, was seminal to what Earl ultimately did. Why did Earl do it? It did give him exposure for his career. It certainly gave Jackson exposure. So it's really interesting, Ashley, when you talk about Peale painting the American Revolutionary heroes. Well, Earl's now in Nashville painting the heroes of what was considered the second great American Revolution at the time. And so he had as many of the characters from the Battle of New Orleans in that museum as he could. He had the president that sat for him, James Monroe, when he visited Nashville in there. So he's really trying to model something very similar. It took a lot of his time and energy. It was not a money-making enterprise. It was free admission for much of the operation of the museum, but it did give him prestige as a painter. It gave advertisement to what he could do as a painter, which was the income kind of he was relying on at that time. And he was invested. He was interested. He was learning Native American languages. He was going and doing digs himself. So whether or not those are we might see some of his actions as misguided today, he was certainly doing, as I mentioned before, something that he thought was beneficial to enhancing the society of Middle Tennessee by offering exposure to these sorts of lessons, be them political, artistic, or what he would call natural curiosity.
We definitely point to this 1818 museum as a predecessor to the Tennessee State Museum. The Tennessee State Museum was formally established in 1937, and it was to bring together the various collections of the state of Tennessee, sort of under sort of one administrative arm, if you will. But some of these early collections that the museum was founded to bring about were some of these items in Earls Museum and also other collections in Tennessee. And so it's interesting working in a museum, because I think about who saved the history, what was kept, what wasn't kept, who is making the choices. And so when we think about historic collections, and I'm curious, and you talk about this, but what narratives and perspectives are missing, and what can historians and museums do to help fill the gaps, if you will, on some of these historic collections, which I think we all wish we can kind of get back and say, well, I wish this was saved, but so many times it hasn't been.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's really important to consider these types of things. Like, who was Earl Painting? What was he saving? Where were his interests? These were the white elites. They were enslavers and slave traders in early Nashville. And certainly that is something you wouldn't know, because those, like you say, those aren't the people and those aren't the stories that come down through history. So it can be a difficult task, but recovering the stories of some of those, for example, enslaved people that were surrounding Earl and Jackson is certainly possible. Often their images aren't there, but through parsing the words of the enslaver, Jackson in this case, you can get traces. And I think you can build stories out of those traces. And there's a lot of, especially historic house museums and places like that that are doing these things. And trying to think about the broader context of the picture instead of usually the white male who Earl was picturing, I think is critical. I have a quote. Let me see if I can find it really quick. An early biographer of Jackson, Marquise James, he said, Earl had become almost as indispensable to the general's comfort as the mulatto George, his body servant. So there's a little trace that Marquise James threw in, but it's interesting to think about those moments. There are at least one, if not multiple, lists of the so-called families of the people enslaved by Jackson. So we can dig up names. We can actually see a number of photographs of formerly enslaved people under Jackson. So I think it's just talking about that stuff and not whitewashing it from history can get you kind of far. And then collecting with an eye toward underrepresentedness in the museum is critical. I don't know how you go about doing that, but I think it's something that should be considered.
All right, well, let's see if we have any questions.
I'm coming.
Okay.
We do have a couple.
Okay, great.
And I'm excited. Can I ask both you, Ashley, and Rachel, if you can speak to the 6 fingers on Jackson's hand in that painting.
I've got to look at it.
We get this question all the time, sharp-eyed school children.
I don't know if I remembered that there were 6 fingers. Is one of them just a gloved finger?
It is. I think the backhand. You don't have to answer that if you don't have an answer.
Do you have an answer, Ashley? I do not.
I don't have an answer for why he has 6 fingers, but I can say, I mean, it's impressive to think about how much he was painting and the quantity of paintings that I could see 6 fingers happening, perhaps. But I'm going to leave that to Dr. Stevens to challenge.
It's funny. I definitely see the 6 fingers now. It's very obvious. I can't answer it, but I can say that this painting, let me see if I can get my details right. The painting was done right as Earl was getting called away to the Seminole Wars in Florida, I believe. So Earl had started what he thought was going to be his masterpiece, and it was, and he had painted the head, sketched in some of the background, and then Jackson left. And so he had his friend, an actor whose name was Noah Ludlow, a local Nashville actor, put on Jackson's attire and stand in for the body because they were roughly the same size. So somehow those extra fingers made it in the midst of all of that chaos of trying to get the portrait completed, I think. And I think you can tell just by the way it looks, he probably did do it very quickly.
That's great context. That's awesome. Another question, a serious, more historic question. Did you find any evidence of Earl painting Isaac Franklin? Is there a list of the Nashvillians that Earl painted?
I wish there was a list. I have like running documents of lists on my computer. You know, I believe Earl almost needs a catalog raisonné, which is, you know, a catalog of all his paintings, just because they're not well documented at all. Over the years since I finished my dissertation, a lot of Earl paintings have come into my inbox through families that own them and send me their snapshots of their portraits. So there are a lot, and there's a lot more than we even know. He did, I believe, paint Isaac Franklin. There is a portrait that has long been attributed to Earl at Belmont. Last I recall, the attribution was possibly in question, and I don't have any records of Earl painting Isaac Franklin. Like, Franklin does not appear in any of the Earl archive or correspondence that I have. It would not at all be surprising if Earl had painted Franklin. Franklin is one of the wealthiest men, of course, in Middle Tennessee. He enslaves hundreds of people on his plantations in Louisiana, and of course he was the notorious slave trader. My colleague Joshua Rothman has just published a book called, oh gosh, The Ledger and the Chain, which is about Isaac Franklin's slave trading business and operation. But I don't want to misspeak. So there is a painting that has long been attributed to Earl of Franklin at Belmont, and director Mark Brown actually knows more about it than I do. But there's another connection there as well, which is that Earl painted O.B. Hayes, who is the father of Adelicia Ackland, who is married to Isaac Franklin. So I have no doubt that that they knew each other, and that Earl was operating in that echelon of society that hung out at the Nashville Inn and that were involved in politics. He painted both Jackson men and a few anti-Jackson men, actually, but there's no good list of all the paintings. I wish there was.
Thank you. It looks like our other comments in the chat bar are just thanking you, Rachel and Ashley, for a job well done. That was the biggest question, and obviously the question about the 6 fingers.
Well, so now I'm gonna ask, is a catalog raisonné in your future?
Oh, I don't know. If there are other historians and writers and academics out there like me, there's about 5 or 6 different projects you would love to do next. And projects take so many years, at least for me, they do. So I'm always tempted and I'm always keeping my files up to date, but I'm not sure. I would love to do I mean, it would be great to have a book that at least did covered Earls Tennessee portraits. I mean, there's enough to fill a whole book, maybe 2. So that would be super interesting. I mean, that would be awesome to have that for Tennessee art history. But I'm not sure.
Well, Dr. Stevens, thank you so much for being here, taking the time out of your busy schedule as you're finishing up your next book. And we can't wait to see sort of that outcome, and just appreciate so much of all the work that you've given all of us just on your research and sharing this, and also sharing your research with us this evening. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see you in Tennessee soon. So I know you've got other projects as well. So
I come back to Nashville as often as I can. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about Earl, which I'm always happy to do. And I think the more Tennesseans that know about his work, the more enlightened we'll be about our state history and cultural history. So thank you.
thank you.
Thank you both. Have a great night, everybody. We hope to see you at book club next month with not maybe as fun guest speakers, but still a good conversation. Have a good night. Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Dr. Stevens.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.